first one on TTIP, initially, I mean, if you like, part of what we're discussing this evening, but it's part of the background, it's kind of creating some of the mood music, like, did you want to take an opportunity to
not particularly
reassure the trade investment partnership?
I have to confess that I don't know a huge amount about the ins and the outs of it, because it wasn't my portfolio when I was in the department. I kind of know enough, as much about it as probably most MPs, and that I've read all the briefings and things like that. And I have to confess, it's one of those areas that completely confuses me, because I read one briefing and it says one thing, and then I need another briefing and it says exactly the polar opposite. And how you actually sort of see between, it's not that the sort of slightly, variants of grey, they are black and white. So I think it's sort of one of those issues that people's perspective on it seems to depend entirely on which side of the argument they're on. And I think the government has said that any agreement that is reached will need to be voted on will have to be voted on by the House of Parliament. So so hopefully it'll be after the election.
It will be. It is going to be.
But I think it's one of those things that actually MPs are going to have to really get to grips with when we actually know what the final agreement says when it's been negotiated. Because I think it's going to be a really, really controversial thing at the time.
We've had other
but there will be a vote.
We've had other fringes of which I've spoken as well, and that kind of reflects this need to get the polarity of that debate, if you like, brought together so that we can test the evidence that both sides are advancing. In relation to, I think the second point with regard to, companies surely can't be surprised at the outcome of that. Do you want to
because I just want to clarify, I said investors were surprised.
Okay.
So, but some companies were surprised as well. I'll tell you why. They had no idea they were using those factories. So, I believe Primark found out they were using that factory when their clothing was found in it, and they immediately came forward. They were the first company to come forward and make a compensation payment. That, however, does go to a problem. I've sat on analyst calls where analysts have told investors, you will find it difficult to find a company that can tell you who all their suppliers are. So there is sort of this overarching problem that has come up through globalization, and I think this again was a theme of Tim Farron's speech yesterday. But we've completely accepted the globalization of trade, and yet the universality or the globalization of human rights appears to have got lost in that mix. And you cannot sacrifice the universality of human rights for globalization of trade. Simplify your supply chain if you can't visualize where it's happening. If you can't figure out whether it's horse meat or cow's meat in your supply chain, simplify it. It's just not good enough to be like, this is the way business is done. It's not being done well enough. So I would say that's the answer to that. Just on TTIP, I think I think there's an issue here around that the lack of awareness and actually knowing what exactly is happening in TTIP, I think, is the fundamental problem. This is going to perhaps be the most significant agreement. It will possibly determine everything, and no one has a clue what's going on. I have real concerns personally that fossil fuel companies would be able to sue for climate change measures that would shut their businesses down, which would of course mean we would never do that then, because it would be, so I think there's real concerns about that, and I think that should be any agreement, a global trade agreement, should be the subject of much greater scrutiny, public debate, transparency. I think that's a problem that we don't know enough about it.
Louise, could you just advise on the question in relation to the violation?
So I think this is really interesting because there's a number of countries that this is a problem in. Russia, there are other issues in Russia, but this was a problem before it was invading other sovereign nations. Sochi Olympics and so on. Some investors are particularly interested in this issue, and companies who've got workforces in those countries, A, what steps are they doing to protect their LGBT employees? B, how does operating in such a country accord with their policies on LGBT rights, which a lot of these companies have? So investors are very interested in it and are engaging in it. And I think it is a question for companies. If you are operating in a country that criminalizes your staff effectively, or some of your staff perhaps, or is certainly operating against your culture, how do you act on that? So I think companies should be asked about it. I think you'll find allies in the private sector on that. They probably won't want to make public critical statements, but I think they would be happy to have conversations. And I think that goes back to something that's in the National Action Plan, actually, which there's an expectation on British business that if there is a breach of human rights that the state is responsible for, there is an expectation that they'll come to the embassy and they'll say, look, we're being asked to do this, and this is a breach of human rights, you know, what do we do? Because you have to obey the local law, but you recognise. So I think that's a good thing in the National Action Plan and companies, but I think you'll find companies that are open to that issue, they're aware of it.
I think the other thing can I just say is that companies consist of employees, both in this country and overseas. And one of the things that can be quite powerful is people want to work for a company that is a good employer. And part of being a good employer is that they feel that it's a company that has good values and so on. And even if you're working for a company that other people would see as, you know, in an evil sector, actually the people that work for that company want to feel that they're actually contributing to the world good. People don't want to work for a company that is sort of propping up some hideously corrupt homophobic regime somewhere else in the world. And so the impact on morale and the impact on productivity and so on around the world of the employees of those companies can be quite affected by that sort of thing. So there is a real business case for companies actually to get involved in this as well. And one of the things I remember from when I was working in international development is that even in the countries where there are really significant aid budgets, international companies control so much more wealth and have so much more financial sway, financial value in those countries than other governments do. So actually, if you can get those, they don't have to speak out publicly against it, but actually getting them to lobby effectively and quietly behind the scenes, they can be far more effective, as in Uganda, they can be far more effective than donating governments.
Thank you, Jenny. If we have time, we'll come back to the farmer if we think it's appropriate to do it. But in relation to the specific question of the voluntary versus mandatory culture point was raised by.
Certainly. I think then the question is, what are we making mandatory and why, and what's voluntary and why? And I think what we're suggesting, and this is very much what I heard Louise say as well, is what's important is that the internal process of reflection happens. So what is sensibly mandatory is saying to companies, demonstrate to us that you know what's going on within your four walls and you're reflecting upon that. What you do with that, where you set the bar in terms of human rights, is for you to decide. But we then will have the information as consumers to say, well, we will buy your goods or we won't. So, and that's where I think the culture starts to change. And sorry, it does link very briefly into the label behind the label bit, because the surprise within companies, there's something about we all go to bed and sleep at night, and we're able to do that because we don't know what's going on in the Rana Plaza factory until the day it blows up. But if we have a responsibility to know our supply chain and know what's going on, then we're going to change the culture within the company because we can't sleep otherwise. So I think the voluntary bit, you're absolutely right, is about what kind of company do we want to preside over. The mandatory bit is us just saying, please demonstrate to us that you know what kind of company you preside over.
Okay, we'll just take a couple more questions here. We have two questions.
I'm John from Business in the Community, and we work quite closely with Biz anyway. Just actually following up on this gentleman's question, I actually think on this agenda we do complicate it, even though we try to make it really simple, purely because if you're a chief executive of a company, actually human rights is just one of the many things that you have to deal with as part of the way that you do this stuff. And actually what I'd like to see is government taking a more proactive role in bringing a lot of this stuff together. So you see now in South Africa, every country has to do, or you have to do an integrated report using existing matrices, I think the Global Reporting Initiative, which a lot of companies already use, which actually have human rights alongside environmental, carbon, those sorts of measures into those things that have to be managed. And actually pulling it together makes it a lot more simple for a company, so it's an easier proposition for them to enact.
Thank you. Yes, we come to the gentleman here. Former Minister Andrew.
Yes, my name's Jeff Payne. I'm from Hackney Liberal Democrats. I'm curious to know what's happening in the supermarket sector at the moment, because Aldi and Lidl are presenting very cheap products and are forcing Sainsbury's and Tesco's and the others to cut prices. And my impression is that prices become the most important thing, regardless of anything else, in order to be competitive. Do you think that sometimes market forces are just so strong that they will override these wider responsibilities?
Okay, thank you. And then
it's Lib MP. I'm sorry to have missed some of the presentations, but I thought you would want to know that there is a new clause to the Modern Slavery Bill which will be debated in committee on Tuesday of next week, which is about amending the Companies Act so that companies have, in addition to their need to include in their report social and environmental considerations, also modern slavery, in other words, to make sure their supply chain is reported on as well. And I'm the proposer of that clause, and up to now we've had a lot of pushback from the government. The Home Office tells us that they can't get other departments to agree, so I'd be interested in Jenny's take on that, and whether she would agree to join with me in putting a little bit of extra pressure on, if necessary, with biz ministers.
thank you for that. On the issue of the complication of the way in which reporting, Louise, you touched on this earlier about the obscure way in which reports are presented. Is there anything, it seems to me that it might even come down to NGOs having to read the reports on behalf of consumers and to blow whistles.
Okay, well, we try to do that, but it's actually not feasible because there's just so much to read. And also, they don't tell you a huge amount. So a non-human rights issue, a fossil fuel company has in its strategic review, which is where they're meant to tell us what the main risks facing the business are, a line that says, climate change regulation presents a major risk to the business. Earth-shattering revelation, that one. They don't tell me what regulation would affect what